Hey, good morning. Today we are going to be making worm casting tea. If you're new here, my name is Kira. Feel free to call me Q and welcome to my garden. So first off, before we start, I do want to say that the process we're going over today is not originally mine. I got it from Jess over at Roots and Refuge Farm, and she did a video where she just did an overview of when they were making worm casting tea for their farm, and then she attached it to this really great detailed blog post that has like all of the instructions, the ingredients list, and all of that. And because she has a really big farm, in her blog post she did instructions for if you were doing it on a big scale in like a 55-gallon drum, or if you wanted to do it on a smaller scale in 5-gallon buckets like we're going to do today. Now, Andrew and I did this once before a couple days ago, and it worked really well. We really liked it, but there were a few things that we learned along the way, and so I thought I'd bring you guys along as we did it again and just kind of like let you know the things that we found that worked for us, or the things that we just didn't know when we first started it. So now to go over all of the things that I have on this table here, the first thing that you're going to need for this recipe is either worm castings like we have here, or you're going to need some compost. Now, you're going to need more than this. This is just an example pile here. Andrew's actually sorting out what we need. And in Jess's instructions, she tells you how much that you need based on how much you're trying to make. And so for us, we're going for about 2 pounds, 1.5 pounds of worm castings for this recipe that we're doing here today. And a couple other things that you'll need. First of all, molasses. We just buy molasses in bulk. You don't actually need a ton of this, but this is going to be what feeds the bacteria so that it multiplies very quickly and gives you the worm tea that you want. And the next thing, you're going to want some sort of like fish emulsion. This is an EB Stone organic one. We had this one. And then this one is from Neptune's Harvest. We actually bought this when we started this project because we weren't sure if the EB Stone one that we had anything else in it. And so we bought this just to be safe. Either one of these work. They're essentially the same for this process. And the next thing you're going to need is some azomite. As far as tools and things that you need, the first thing that you're going to want to get is something to kind of like aerate or bubble the water. Now, we ended up getting this little fish tank pump because we're doing this in 5-gallon buckets. You don't need something that's super strong. Any kind of fish tank pump is great. And we got this one because Andrew said it was highly rated on Amazon, so that's just what we went with. I'm going to have links to all this stuff in the description below also. And one thing that we didn't know when we first bought this is that the tubing is actually sold separately. So we did have to wait another day for the tubing to come, and that was fine. But just make sure that you know that with whatever pump that you get, make sure that you know if the tubing is included or if you have to buy it separately. The cool thing about this one, and I think it's why the tubing is separate, is because you can actually create chains and hook them up to multiple fish tanks. And so for us, what we're going to do is we're going to have multiple buckets going at once so that we can make enough fertilizer for our entire garden in one go. So that's kind of neat. You're going to need either a tablespoon or a teaspoon, or if you're really used to just kind of eyeballing those, you can do that too. We actually did that the first time. If you want, disposable gloves are really great for the fish emulsion. It's not required, you don't need it, but if you do want to just keep the smell off your hands, that's a good way to go. The other thing we have here, we have an extension cord so that we can hook up our air pump to where our actual outlet is outside, because this is definitely something you don't want to do in your house if you can avoid it. It does have a smell. It smells like fish. And so we have that. The next thing you're going to need to do is get some sort of bag to put the worm castings in or the compost in as you submerge it. So we ended up getting just nut bags for that purpose, and it worked really well. And then we have 2 5-gallon buckets here. With this, because of the size of our garden, we're actually getting 2 more buckets so that we can do everything at once. Because for one application of this, you do kind of need 2 buckets, especially if you live in the city like we do. You have to dechlorinate the water before you start, which takes 24 hours. And then once you are finished making your tea, you dilute it 50-50. And so you basically need 2 buckets of dechlorinated water going before you start this process. And then we have watering cans. We have 2 only because we wanted to both be able to water the garden at once and get it done faster. You really only need 1. And then we found it helpful to just have another little bowl to dilute things in. This is, again, optional. It doesn't even have to be this size. And then you're going to need something to stir everything into and make sure, especially the azomite is like really mixed in really well and dissolved before you start. And then you're also going to want something to suspend the bag over the water. And we got real fancy for both of these. We use sticks. So we have our super high-tech stir stick, and then we put a log over the bucket just like that, and to tie the bag to submerge it, real fancy and high-tech. So that's everything that you're going to need for this process. The actual making of the worm casting tea is very hands-off. It takes like 5 minutes to put everything together once you have all the material. So what Andrew's doing here is he's just separating out the worms from the castings, and he found that it was way easier and just faster to spread them out on a table like this, because then you can see more of them at once and pick them out just a lot faster. So he's already filled up one bag and he's working on the other one, because we're doing kind of like a double batch of this so that we can, like I said, do our entire garden at once. He also found that it was helpful to have like a bench scraper or something like this, so that in the end he can just like scrape up all the castings and put them in the bag a lot faster. So this is the part of the process that we found takes the longest out of the entire thing. And let's say that you don't want to go through this, this tedious part of it, or maybe you just started your worm farm and you don't have enough castings yet, or you don't have enough compost if you're doing this and making compost tea. I think you can still do this entire thing and just buy like a bag of worm castings or a bag of compost from your garden center. And we haven't done that, but you're buying those things for the nutrients that are there. And so it would make sense to me that this would still work. And I think that that would actually be a really great way to get more bang for your buck if you are going to buy a bag of worm castings or something like that, because for every £1.5 or 2 pounds of castings that you buy or get in that bag, you're turning it into essentially 10 gallons of fertilizer. And so you would get way more fertilizer than you would if you had just bought the bag and put that in your garden. It's also pretty handy if you're like me and you're all about the worm castings, but you're not quite ready to go in there and start grabbing worms on your own, and you don't have a loving husband who will do it for you. Then I think that buying one of those bags would be a great way to go. Here Andrew is assembling all of the tubing. First he had to take apart what we had before, because we originally built it for just one bucket and then decided that we wanted to redo it so that we could do multiple. We also thought that we had it backwards, which turns out we actually had it right the first time. But he took that orange filter piece out and put in this T so that we could have more than one bucket. And then he just used this cutter that we have for our irrigation system. So pretty easy, and he was able to put that together pretty quickly. And the next step is to get whatever you're going to put across the top of your buckets. In our case, we're using just logs and sticks that we had, and you're going to tie the top of the bag around. You want to make sure that it's not touching any side of the inside of the bucket. So for that, with a bag this size, we tied it pretty tight or pretty close up here, and that worked really well so that it could be submerged without touching the sides or bottom. All right, so the first thing we're doing is we are putting the azomite in, and so we need about a tablespoon and a half. Yeah, a tablespoon and a half of this stuff, and we're doing 2 buckets, and so I'm going to put a tablespoon and a half in each one. This doesn't have to be like super precise or anything like that. Whoop. Try not to splash all over yourself. There you go. So that's one, and then I'll do about a half in each one. For the instructions, it says for the azomite to make sure that you stir it in really, really well, because otherwise it will potentially like gum up either your pump, or if you're using a sprayer, it might gum up your sprayer. So where's my handy dandy tool? When we were doing research on this, we were originally going to use a sprayer instead of a watering can, but when we looked into it, we saw that a lot of people recommended actually not using a sprayer, because for a lot of the like small home sprayers, they get clogged really, really quickly just in general making things like compost tea and worm casting tea. So we decided to go against it. Now you still can use a sprayer. I've seen people use a sprayer and they swear by it and it was fine. But we figured we would just get watering cans anyway and do it that way. What I'm doing is I'm just going until I can't feel the like grittiness at the bottom. And last time I did this, even though I did stir for a pretty long time, in the end when we were pouring it out, we did actually still have some azomite in here. So this is one thing that you want to just kind of like take your time and do. So for this next step, we're doing the molasses and the fish emulsion. Now what you want to do for this step is you want to dilute it a little bit. And when we did this the first time, we realized that we only had one bucket of already dechlorinated water because we live in the city and we filled up just the one. And so what we did was essentially we just took some water out of a bucket. You really don't need that much because it's just a couple tablespoons of stuff. And we mixed our molasses and fish emulsion right into a separate little container here. All right, and so it is a teaspoon of molasses. And I'm just going to do one at a time, so I'm going to do this twice. So I have my molasses in here, stir it up. Fish emulsion. This is the stuff I definitely do not want on my clothes. And it's a teaspoon and a half, so I'm just going to over pour. Like that. Stir that guy in. And once it's all mixed up, got a little bit on the tablespoon there, you just pour it into the bucket. Then I'm going to grab some water from the other bucket and do that again. Now I'm just going to give each one of these just one more good stir. Not necessary probably. I'm going to do it anyway. All right. So now I'm going to move these a little bit so you can see both of them. And then the next thing that we're going to do is put our pump in. So you take these little stones at the bottom and you just submerge them. Super simple. And just let them sit at the bottom of each bucket. And then let me plug in my pump here so it starts bubbling. Okay, so this is definitely vibrating. I think last time we did this, it kind of started bubbling immediately. Okay, I can feel it on this tube. I can't really feel it on these tubes though. Let me grab Andrew and do some troubleshooting. All right, so we figured it out. Turns out this little filter piece, we had it right the first time, and as soon as Andrew switched it back again, it started bubbling. Now let me bring you in so you can kind of see what this looks like. So here you can see how much they're bubbling. Andrew did say that it seems that they're not bubbling quite as strong now that there's two of these hooked up to this instead of when we just had one before, but it's totally fine. You mostly just need to add air. It doesn't need to just like bubble like crazy or look like it's boiling or anything like that. It just needs air added to the water. So now that we have our pumps ready, the last step is to add the worm castings or compost if that's what you're doing. So we have these guys here. We're just going to lower them in and set them on top just like that, making sure that the bags are not touching the sides or the bottom, and you're good to go. So you can see how fast and easy this was. Once you have all of the stuff and the setup the way you want it, all of that, it goes quicker every time. I think the thing that takes the most time is really just sorting out the worms from the worm castings if you have like your own home farm. So now this is just going to sit for 24 hours and do its thing, and I will see you back when we're ready for the next step. Good morning, guys. It's the next day and we're about at the 24-hour mark, and so I wanted to give you an update on where we're at. So this is what the worm tea is looking like right now. You see we have a decent amount of bubblage in this one. It's actually stronger in this one, so that was interesting. This one looks like it's going pretty well. You can see the little wormies at the top of the bag there. Now last time we did this, we did find out that some of the worms that had kind of just crawled to the top actually survived because we took the spent castings here and put them in our garden, and a lot of the worms were still like moving around and stuff. So that is hopeful. It made me feel a little bit better that some of these little guys who ended up being missed in the sorting process still made it. As far as where we are in the process now, the smell on these has gone down significantly. So it doesn't have that like fishy smell anymore from the fertilizer, but it does kind of have the kelp smell a little bit, if that makes sense. To me, because I grew up in California, it now just kind of smells like the ocean. So I hope that makes sense to you too. It's very mild. Before you could smell it, you know, across our patio. Right now I'm standing right next to it and I kind of have to put my face a little bit closer to really get a good whiff of it. And I do remember in Jess's video, they were talking about how it shouldn't smell and it should be kind of neutral, and that's when you know it's done. Now if it still had the really strong fishy smell, then you need to just give it a little bit more time. So like I'm right on these right now and I actually barely smell it, and I have a very sensitive nose. But we're going to end up giving these a little bit more time anyway, just because one is bubbling a little bit slower than the other. And honestly, it just works for our schedule to do this a little bit later in the day. So we're going to keep them bubbling for now and come back to them a little bit later. But as of right now, I mean, they're probably pretty ready to go. All right, so now it's the end of the day and we are ready for this project. So if you are going to fertilize something in general, it's better to do it either early in the morning, in the evening, or when it's overcast, just so that your plants don't get burned in any kind of way. We turned the pump off. We're going to take these little tubes out of here, and then we are going to take our worm casting bags, and we're just going to put them, set them aside in this bowl right here. One, so that we can get whatever liquid, I think we might need 2 bowls actually, whatever liquid is still in this, we want to use that because it's still good fertilizer. So we're going to let that drip on its own, and then when we're ready, we're going to actually dump the rest of these spent castings in our garden as well. Now we're ready to actually fill up our watering cans. So this is a 2-gallon can, and what you want to do for these fertilizers is you want to dilute them in half essentially. And so I'm going to fill this one up halfway with our worm tea, and then Andrew is at 2 other buckets that we did, again because we doubled this. So if you're doing just one batch, it'd be one batch of castings and one other bucket, but Andrew is filling up a bucket with water that is dechlorinated, so it's been sitting out for 24 hours while this stuff was cooking or brewing. I'm getting this all over the table too. All right, so that's about half, and then we're going to switch. All right, now here we go down to the garden. The thing with the watering cans is it goes really fast, and so we found out that with spraying pretty, sparsely at first, we can kind of cover one of these 4 by 16 foot beds with one 2-gallon watering can. And so that's our goal, is to get one full can in one of these beds. And for our 8-foot beds, we try to get one watering can to fertilize 2 beds. One thing to be careful of, just from my own mistakes, is when you are using a watering can, make sure you spray gently at first, or else you lose a lot coming out of the top. We also found that one batch of this fertilizer pretty much covers about 2 of our 16-foot beds. And so if you had 4 by 8-foot beds, then it covers about 4 of them. And then after that, we have about this much left over in the bottom of the bucket for us to use on everything else. Now, the other thing is, when you are applying this, Jess did say to cover the plants and also the soil. And so that's what we're doing. I'm not trying to completely soak these plants just because I'm trying to make the fertilizer stretch a little bit, but I am definitely spraying the tops of all of the shorter stuff. So yeah, that's it. Super easy process. I will link all of Jess's stuff down below, along with just the list of all the things that we used. And I hope that this was helpful for you. If you decide to give worm casting tea a try, I would love to hear about how it goes for you in the comments below. But thank you so much for joining us in our garden over the last couple days. And I'm so happy we get another chance to grow together. I'll see you soon.